All right, so let's talk about how you do a SPACECAT annotation. So a SPACECAT annotation is just really digging into a text for those things we've been talking about: speaker, purpose, audience, context, exigence, choices, appeals, and tone, okay? So at the top of your document, there is kind of a key of what you should include in a SPACECAT annotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually only going to read a couple paragraphs of this just to show you how I would go about marking these things and what kind of information I'd want to pull from the text. And then you're going to do the same thing on your challenger speech, because that is the one that is used on your test, okay? So I'm showing you how to do the annotation, and then you can go ahead and do the same for your own passage. Okay, so I'm just going to switch to draw so that I know I can write on here. And you'll notice that on the key, there are some color coding things. It's a lot to keep track of, so I think a great way to approach it, and really any text, is when you have the time, read it twice, okay? So like I said, I'm only going to read a few paragraphs, probably the first two, and then just kind of demonstrate how I would do it. But if I was going to do a full SPACECAT annotation, I would probably just read for understanding first, and then kind of go back and pick out things that fit that annotation, okay? So let's start with, let me undo that. Our information at the top here. This is Neil Armstrong's NASA speech. It was it's transcribed, I should say, by Space, and the date is the 25th of September in 2008. This is a transcript of a speech by Neil Armstrong made at NASA's 50th anniversary celebration hosted by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Now, I already know there are some SPACECAT things to mark, but I will come back to those because I want to read these first two paragraphs to kind of get a feel for what we're looking at, and then I'll show you how to annotate. So it starts. In the summer of 1958, the Congress wrote and the President signed the National Space Act, establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and I remember the time clearly. 50 years ago this week, I was high above the California desert piloting a B-29 carrier aircraft and launching the X-1E, the latest and most advanced in the fabled X-1 research airplane series. NASA became an operating agency on October 1st, 1958. I found myself that Wednesday morning going to work at my same job, my same office, doing the same work that I'd been doing the previous day. It was a relatively easy transition. We were already riding on rockets and research aircraft. We already knew how to count backwards. 8, 7, 6, 5. All right, so like I said, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to take a second here and start marking some stuff. So speaker is blue, so let me get the correct color here. There's my blue. And it says circle the speaker's name. Well, that's pretty easy, but I just got to move my screen up here a little bit. Our speaker is Neil Armstrong. And then it says highlight any information about him. He does reveal some, so let's use the blue highlighter. And he was piloting the carrier craft and launching the X-1E. He was already riding rockets and research aircraft. These are just kind of background information about what he was doing. So those would all be attributed to speaker because that is information about Neil Armstrong. Now, we all know more than that, I would hope, about Neil Armstrong. So I'm going to add some notes too for my annotation. And obviously, I know he is the first man on the moon. Supposedly, if you're a conspiracy theorist. But that's what he's known for. So I'm going to add that note because it's additional information that I can bring to this text, and that's what annotation should do. All right. So for what I've read so far, I've kind of checked off that box. Underline any evidence of purpose. So I'm looking at purpose now. Where does the speaker convey what they want to see happen? What does the speaker need? Now, we've only read a short portion of this, so we actually haven't dug into that yet. I mean, we can make guesses based on other aspects of the rhetorical situation, right? But we haven't, in the two paragraphs we've read, seen anything really about purpose yet. Now, obviously, had we read the whole thing, we would find it later on. We'd look for statements about what is he there for? What is he trying to do? But the thing about purpose is it's not always going to be explicitly in there. So I might write notes in a margin next to where I'm kind of getting a sense of what they want to do. So to show you what that would look like, I'm going to go up here where it mentions it's the 50th anniversary. Switch to a black pen here for simplicity's sake. But it's a celebration, right? So that could be something in the purpose. It's to celebrate the birthday, I suppose, so to speak, of NASA. So that would be acknowledgement of purpose for sure. Now, audience, we know that these people are here for this anniversary celebration, all right? And we know that they are at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. But let's see if there's anything in those two paragraphs that we can mark for audience. And we want to use green. So it says, mostly this first part is about himself. So for audience, I don't think we have enough information yet. But as we read, what we'd be looking for is any acknowledgement of the people in the room. Now, I've read this piece. So if I skip down, you'll notice in this paragraph where it says, in any case, I suspect there are some number of people here tonight who remember the birth of NASA, and he's asking those people to stand up and different things like that. That is definitely acknowledgement of audience, because he's kind of fleshing out who these people are, people who worked for NASA, those who worked for NACA, those who worked for JPL and for Redstone, and he's kind of listing specific subsections of the audience. That would definitely be something we would highlight for the audience part of a SPACECAT analysis. The next thing is context. Now, there is a lot of contextual information provided already. I'm going to use red. Let's go back to the top because that's where a lot of it is. So when we're talking about context, we have right here the date, right? We also have the context of it being transcribed by this space magazine. It is the 50th anniversary of NASA, and then the location is also part of the context. Because remember, context is anything that's kind of surrounding this moment outside of that rhetorical situation. So definitely all of those pieces play into the context. Now down here in these first two paragraphs, he hasn't really delved too deep into the context, but he does talk about how exigence. For this one, it wants us to highlight, so let me switch to yellow. And I think the exigence is pretty straightforward. It's right here. It's the 50th anniversary celebration, right? That's the moment, event, whatever, that's inspiring this speech to be given. And then knowing that, go back down here, we could highlight the 50 years ago part, talking about how this is a celebration, okay, and how they're remembering what happened 50 years ago, and because that is the exigence for this particular speech, okay? All right. Now, in these first few paragraphs, what can we figure out for rhetorical or stylistic choices? And it's telling us that we should put them in the right margin. So let me change my color here because I'm spending all my time choosing colors, I guess, but there we go. This whole part in the beginning is an illustration. He's talking about the moment he found out about it. He's piloting planes. He's doing this kind of experimental flight program. And he's kind of showing us that moment before, he became an astronaut and when he found out himself. So that is a rhetorical choice, talking about that illustrates that moment. So an assertion would be like, Neil Armstrong illustrates the moments before he became a part of NASA and then you would explain why he does that, knowing the full context of the speech. So that would be a rhetorical choice. Glancing through here, stylistically, there aren't a ton of things in these first two paragraphs. Obviously, you might notice the repetition of we were, we are already, that repetition of we, but we would have to see that more in the text to really justify that that's a choice. But we do have that example of illustration. A choice. Now, appeals, it says to highlight them in purple. Right off the bat in these first two paragraphs, we don't really have an example of a rhetorical appeal yet, except sorry, I'm going to undo that one, go on a little rogue at the end there. But if we look at this part, I'm going to add a note to kind of explain why I picked that out. But he is kind of an expert, right? Because he started at the ground level of NASA, this experimental type flying before it became what it is. So that his own credibility, his own experience. And then the last thing, let me check off appeals. The last thing would be his tone. And it says to divide the passage into logical tonal sections and then label them. So let's just label this first part that we have, because if we look right here, throughout the whole thing, because that's the thing about tone. You can't just point to a phrase. It's kind of in these two first paragraphs. But he's talking about, like I said, that moment when he remembered finding out about NASA, learning what it was, knowing it was going to be the moment it became an official agency. And to me, back to these days when he was working as a pilot in this experimental force, and kind of thinking about that time fondly. And the reason is he's talking about talking to his same office and the same work and things like that before this big change in his life that became NASA. So that is a SPACECAT annotation for only a few paragraphs. But this is a really thorough annotation for just 2 paragraphs. This type of marking then would continue through the rest of the passage. It might not be as dense as is shown right here, but that's the gist of it. Kind of, like I said, get a sense for the work as a whole, and then kind of go back and dive into those different aspects of SPACECAT. Because what I want to see is that, one, you understand that rhetorical situation and you can tell me where you find it. Because what happens in your multiple choice exam is they don't really give you a lot of context information. So I want to see you go to the text to figure out what can you learn about the audience, what can you learn about the speaker, things like that. And then similarly with rhetorical choices and stylistic choices, I want you to be able to point to those as well, because that's going to be so helpful for that rhetorical analysis essay that you'll do at in the written part of your test. So what I did for these first 2 paragraphs, do it for the whole piece. Your text is provided, and good luck.